I'm Bernina expert Amanda Murphy, and I'd like to show you how to use my Every Petal quilting templates. There are two sets of templates. The first quilts petals that are narrow in their shape, and the second quilts wider petals. So let's get started. If you'd like to quilt a single petal motif and you want it to be centered on a crosshairs, you start by marking that crosshairs. And then you can use the center lines on the template to help position your petal. So you can see here, the center lines are aligned right on my crosshairs. Slip the petal over the foot to find your starting point, put the presser foot down, and then move the template out of the way to bring up your bobbin thread. Then bring your presser foot down again. This is very important before you bring the template over because, of course, you do not want to crash on the quilting template. And now quilt all the way around the petal. Now I started off quilting with tiny stitches, and then I increased my stitch length because here I am on the Bernina Q16, and so I have stitch regulation, and I quilted all the way around the petal before reducing my stitch length again. Of course, if you're quilting for a quilt show, you'll want to bury your threads instead of starting with those little tiny stitches. Now it's time to bring up my bobbin thread. So I move my template out of the way, I grab onto that top thread and I hold on to it while I make one more stitch, and then I pull on both the thread I was holding and the thread coming out of the machine, and that pulls up the bobbin thread. And then I clip all the threads a little bit away from the machine to leave the thread tail a little longer. Let's quilt a petal inside a petal. So we'll begin again by finding our starting point. So I'm using the center lines on the template to line it up with the crosshairs that I drew on my fabric with chalk. And then I find my starting point, I move the template away, and I bring up that bobbin thread. Now I bring the presser foot down and then move the template up into position, and I quilt all the way around the petal shape. Now here again, I'm doing the little stitches because I'm not quilting for a quilt show, right? You want to bury your threads if you're going to quilt in a competition, but usually I just use the tiny stitches to begin. Now, when I got to the top center of that petal, I switched out the template to a smaller petal, and this is Every Petal set 2 because it's wider. And now I switch back to my original petal shape, and I complete the quilting. I forgot to do those tiny stitches, so I'm doing them right now. Time to end my thread. And next we'll do another variation of this, and in this variation the points of the two petals will meet rather than the tops of the petals. So once again, I quilt around my petal shape. And of course, the petals are easy templates to use because they're internal shapes. It is always easier to quilt an internal shape than an external shape. So this time I return to the point before switching the template. And you'll notice the slits on this template are wide enough to fit around the neck of the foot, but they are not too wide. You can't quilt down them, and that is intentional. I want you to be able to have a nice crisp corner at the bottom of each petal. So there's another variation. Now let's get fancy and quilt some petal rows. Petals make excellent borders, and the designs are really easy to execute, even though they look complex. So you'll see here I'm using the dashed lines on my template to center the petal to my border that I've drawn on my fabric. Now, if you wanted to center the petals to the border, you'd want to start in the center and work out, but I'm just going to do a simple border from left to right. And again, I'm using my dashed lines to help me center the motif nicely. And I have a couple of different options here. The first would be to quilt a petal and a half and then move the template over. So I'm going to quilt around until I get back to the right side of the petal, and there's a little solid black line on the ruler that helps you know it's past the center line. This little solid black line helps you know where the petals should touch. And now I move the template over And then again, I'm going to quilt all the way around the petal, a petal and a half, until I get to that other little black line. So don't stop at the center line, because the center line is not the widest point of the petal. You want to stop the little black line above the center line. And now I move the template over, right? And every time I move the template over, the black curved lines on the ruler will go over my previous petal. Now, don't get too precious about this and worry if your stitches are a little off, because of course fabric has give, but plastic does not. Plastic is perfect, right? So if your lines are a little off, don't worry too much, but they're there to help you. Now next, I want to do an offset row of petals. So when you're quilting an offset row, you're concentrating on the white curved lines on the quilting template. So when those white lines are over my previous row of motifs, I can be sure that I'm quilting petals that are offset perfectly between the petals in my first row. So again, I'm looking at those white lines. Those white lines need to be over the first row of petals that I stitched. And then I'm in perfect position for an offset row. And what I love about this design is that it's really simple to execute, but it looks so complex. People just wonder, how did you quilt this motif? But actually it's easy, because again, it's an internal template shape. So I'm looking at those white lines, using them to line up this next row of petals. Now, another way to execute a petal row is, of course, to quilt the top of the petals and then the bottom of the petals. But usually with the petals, I prefer to do kind of a petal and a half each time, because they don't touch on the center line. They touch at the widest point of the petals, and I just find that less confusing. So then you have a beautiful row of offset petals. Now, let's quilt a column of petals underneath this motif I'm at right now. So I'm just going to extend the center line of that motif down, and I used a Sharpie here so you could see. Obviously you should not use a Sharpie on your quilts, right? But what you'll notice here is the black curved lines at the top of the ruler now lie over that previous petal. Now, when I'm quilting a vertical column of petals, I do usually quilt the right of one petal and then the left of the next, and then as I work back up, I catch the other side of the motifs. But you can really work it anyway. Certainly you could quilt a petal and a half and then continue on as well, and that would be fine. And now you have a beautiful column of petals. Let's quilt an offset column of petals. So this time we're going to be paying attention to the white lines on the template. And we want those white lines positioned over this first column of petals that we've quilted. So I'm going to quilt over my previous lines to get to my starting point, and I'm going to bring the template down. And you can see here the white lines are going over my previous petals. And that's how I know I'm in the correct position to start. So I'm going to quilt the left side of the first petal and then the right side of the second. And I like to switch directions just because I think it looks neater not to back out of the quilting. Now you can get a different look based on the set of templates you use. So here I was using set 2, and here's set 1, which is narrower in shape. Set 2 again. And if you have a wider border, you could do a double row of motifs. And you can even do an offset double row. So that's a great way to deal with a really wide border. Next, we'll quilt a petal blossom. So I've gone ahead and drawn some lines on my fabric at 60-degree increments. So I have 6 lines, but you could also do 8, or you could do 4. And I'm going to start in the center of this motif, and I'm going to quilt the first petal centered on one of these spokes. So I'm using the vertical line on the template to position my motif, and I'm going to quilt all the way around the petal and return to center. So I'm going to clip my threads before I return, and then I'm going to quilt the petal opposite. usually I prefer to continue on with a curved line if at all possible, rather than quilting a point. The problem with quilting points as you create a motif like this is that they all ideally should meet in the center, and we all know that doesn't always happen. So I try to continue on a curve as much as I can. I'm quilting all the way around this petal, and I have wool batting here. Wool batting creates such a nice puffy look. I really love it for special motifs like this, and this would be a perfect motif for a hexagon quilt. See, we're already done with 4 petals right here. I continue on again, looking at the lines on my template to ensure that I'm placing the petal correctly. And then I have my last petal to quilt. And I return to center. So that's how you quilt a blossom, and there's so many different variations you can do of this motif. It's a really fun one to play with. So here I have another larger 6-petal design, and here's a 4-petal with the accent petal inside each, and here's an 8-petal design with an accent inside each. And finally, here I've turned around the template so that the points are out, and I'm starting from the curved portion of the petal. You can do this with lots of petals or just with a few. It's really up to you. This design is so versatile. Next, let's look at some of these designs on a quilt top. So this is my very popular twirl quilt. It's a simple foundation piece pattern, and it's easier than it looks. You can find the pattern on my website, but in this pattern, in the borders, I've used the motifs that you can make with my Every Petal Set 2 and Every Leaf Set 1 quilting templates to create a dynamic look. Also available for a limited time is my Every Petal quilting panel that goes with my Vibrancy quilting collection for Contempo of Benertex. And this works with my Every Petal Set 1 set of rulers, and there's an accompanying guide that really teaches you how to create different petal designs. There's tons of diagrams, and it takes you through it step by step. You can find the panel, the guide, and the templates either at your local sewing machine retailer or on my website. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to make petal designs. Don't forget to subscribe to me on YouTube and join my Facebook group, Quilting with Amanda Murphy. See you next time.